So good evening, everyone. Welcome to this very important event. It is our event that we're calling Elections, Demonstrations, and Insurrections. I'm Stephanie Shonekan. I'm Professor of Music and Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Science here at the University of Missouri. Alongside my colleague, law professor David Mitchell, who you will be hearing from very shortly, I am co-director of the Michael A. Middleton Center for Race, Citizenship, and Justice here at the University of Missouri, which was conceived by a cross-section of Mizzou faculty, staff, and students, and which is now established as a partnership between the College of Arts and Science and the School of Law. The center, which was inaugurated last semester, was envisioned as a space where we could engage in the multidisciplinary scholarly study of and engagement with race, citizenship, and justice in the United States and beyond. The events of January 6th, just a week ago, and indeed the news of today, give us an opportunity to do just that. So welcome to the first in our Middleton Center conversation series, where we hope to engage our campus and city community in conversations about important topics, national, international, and local. As I told a group of first-year students earlier this week, one of our most important values at Mizzou is the value of discovery. On this campus, we define discovery as a value that, quote, often fractures existing worldviews and requires acceptance of uncertainty and ambiguity. Therefore, the university supports all its members in this lifelong process that is both challenging and rewarding. As we seek greater understanding and wisdom, we also recognize that knowledge itself has boundaries. What we know is not all that is, end of quote. So that's on our university website. So this evening, we continue in our journey of discovery by inviting 6 Mizzou scholars from different disciplines to unpack what happened at the Capitol and in the country last week. David Mitchell and I will moderate a conversation with our panelists for the first hour or so, and then we will invite questions from the audience, those of you who have joined us this evening. Please use the Q&A tab on your screen to submit your questions. Before I hand over to David to introduce our panel, I want to thank Michael Middleton, for whom this center is named, our deans, Pat Oker of Arts and Science and Larissa Linsky of Law, our administrative support staff, Hannah Lister, and our communications and advancement teams, Jen Horton, Kristen Meyer, Karen Nylon, and Joseph Swanigan. And I want to say a deep, sincere gratitude to our donors who have been incredibly generous already. If you'd like to join this wonderful group of donors, or if you'd like to see the recording of our inaugural event from the fall and announcements for upcoming programs, please go to our website, middletoncenter.missouri.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter at MUMiddleton, and you can contact us via our email address, which is middletoncenter@missouri.edu. Before we go any further, we are so happy to have Michael Middleton in the room. So Michael, would you say a few words and then we'll keep going.
Sure, thank you very much, Stephanie. And I'd like to welcome all the panelists and the audience to this important conversation. I don't have much to say because I've been otherwise occupied all day, and I'm trying to catch up with the news as it develops so rapidly. But I can say that I'm really, really concerned about what has happened to our country over the past several days. And I worry greatly about, even though we seem to be getting past the current catastrophe, but even if we resolve the existing dispute enough to keep us going, we're still going to have to deal with the attitudes and the sentiment that propelled those people to invade the Capitol building with violence, racism, and all of what is making these people so upset. I'm delighted to be able to hear from people from a variety of disciplines with some impressive expertise to bring your perspective to this problem that this country has dealt with since the beginning, so that we can figure out how to get past it. It's not going away with this impeachment. It's not going away with this inauguration. It's going to take people to seriously discuss these issues and develop solutions. So I appreciate your being here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. And now I'll hand over to my co-director, the Ruth L. Hulston Professor of Law, David Mitchell.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Mike. Welcome again to everyone out there who's actually joining us this evening. It's an important conversation, and I'm glad that you took time out of your schedules to be with us. I'm incredibly excited once more for us to begin this conversation series and to have a distinguished group of scholars, an interdisciplinary group of scholars, to comment on the events that happened last week. Comments that I think had us all transfixed as a nation and as individuals as we watched and as we sort of move from that point in time, thinking about where we go from there. So without further ado, I'm going to throw this out there. I'm going to put out what the prompt is first, and I'll repeat it just so that folks can hear. The prompt for our experts this evening is quote as follows: from your particular scholarly perspective, how can we think about the events of January 6th and how they impact any or all of the pillars of the Middleton Center: race, citizenship, and justice? Speaking with us this evening, we have Ruby Bailey, is the executive editor, Columbia Missourian, and the Missouri Community Newspaper Management Chair. Professor Bailey earned her a bachelor's degree from Wayne State University and worked for the Flint Journal in Flint, Michigan for 3 years before joining the Detroit News. In 1998, she joined the staff of the Detroit Free Press, where she worked for 16 years. She was a business and enterprise reporter and became a Washington correspondent, where she covered news of interest to Michigan readers. She also covered the 9/11 attacks and was embedded with the U.S. Navy in 2003 for 3 months covering Operation Iraqi Freedom. And she later became an assistant metro editor in Detroit, focused on improving the newspaper's online edition. And in 2014, she joined the Sacramento Bee, where she led a team of reporters focused on increasing and improving their digital content, with experience in covering all editing aspects of local news, business, entertainment, feature, and coverage. Professor Frank Bowman is the Floyd R. Gibson Missouri Endowed Professor of Law and the author of High Crimes and Misdemeanors: The History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump. Quite fitting once again. Professor Bowman joined the faculty in 2005 from the Indiana University School of Law, where he was the M. Dale Palmer Professor of Law. He graduated from Harvard Law School. He entered the U.S. Department of Justice as part of the Honors Graduate Program. He spent 3 years as a trial attorney in the criminal division in Washington, D.C. From 83 to 86, 1983 to 86, he was a deputy district attorney for Denver, Colorado, and also spent 3 years in private practice. In 89, he joined the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida, where he was the deputy chief of the Southern Criminal Division and specialized in complex white-collar crimes. And in 95 and 96, he served as special counsel to the U.S. Sentencing Commission in Washington, D.C. And from 1998 to 2001, he served as an academic advisor to the Criminal Law Committee of the United States Judicial Conference. Professor Jay Dow is a Kinder Institute faculty fellow and professor of political science, and from 2017 to 2020 served as the Frederick A. Middlebush Chair in Political Science. Before coming to Mizzou, he earned an undergraduate degree at the University of Oregon and a PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, and his research focuses on voting and elections, which he approaches from the public choice tradition in political science, as reflected in his recent book, Electing the House: The Adoption and Performance of the Single-Member District Electoral System. And he regularly teaches courses on American government, parties, and elections, and American political thought, as well as the Constitutional Debates course for the Kinder Institute's Honors College series. And he also organizes the Jefferson Book Club, an extracurricular undergraduate reading group. Professor Stephen Graves is an assistant professor and the director of undergraduate studies in the Black Studies Department. He specializes in Black politics, political theory, and American government. His research focuses on Black political ideologies, social movements, and the intersection of racism and American political thought. He is the author of A Crisis of Leadership and the Role of Citizens in Black America: Leaders of the New School, a theoretical examination of the concepts of the citizen, citizenship, and leadership. and he continues his dedication to the community as founder of Troublesome Movement, a nonprofit organization that focuses on community outreach and providing educational and professional services to minorities and underprivileged groups. As a teacher and scholar, Dr. Graves' thinking is guided by a strong commitment to servant leadership and the importance of intellectual virtue. He is an affiliate member of the Department of Political Science and the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy. Professor Rabia Gregory is an associate professor and director of graduate studies. Her primary research interest is the history of Christianity in medieval and early modern Europe. She approaches the study of religion through book history, material culture, and theories of gender. Her first book, Marrying Jesus in Medieval and Early Modern Northern Europe, Popular Culture and Religious Reform, uses previously unpublished cultural artifacts to revise long-standing assumptions about religion, gender, and popular culture. She demonstrates that by the 14th century, worldly, sexually active brides of Christ, both male and female, were no longer aberrations, and provide a history of the dispersion of theology in the bride of Christ in the period between the 12th and 17th centuries, and explains how this metaphor, initially devised for a religious elite, became integral to a laity's pursuit of salvation. Her research also involves situating the literary culture of late medieval and early modern women's religious communities within their social and cultural networks. She has also published on the relationship between religion, new media, and medieval culture in contemporary video games, and is currently preparing a critical introduction, biography, and facing page edition and translation of the poetry of Anna Binz, and working on a study of the late 15th and 16th century German Christianity told through the life and art of Albrecht Dürer. She's also the co-editor of the interdisciplinary book series Christianities, Before Modernity. And lastly, Professor Julius Riles, sorry, Julius. Julius M. Riles is an assistant professor of communications. Professor Riles researches the interplay between media use and social relationships. He theoretically approaches this examination from several perspectives. Specifically, he psychologically explores how exposure to social group portrayals can influence social perceptions and inclinations pertaining to those groups, the mechanisms by which social relationships influence media use, and the experience of parasocial relationships with figures in the media. His research agenda concerns practices pertaining to both traditional and digital media, and his interdisciplinary approach has led to research in the subdisciplines of both health communication and political communication. He has published in top-ranked peer-reviewed outlets such as the Journal of Communication, New Media and Society, Communication Research, Media Psychology, Communication Monographs, and Health Communication. And he has received several awards for teaching, research, and service, such as the Campus Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching, an award given to the top 5 graduate teaching instructors from among the thousands at the University of Illinois. And he has been honored at Mizzou as the Advisor of the Year by the Department of Communications Graduate Student Body, and as the Mass Communication Division Teaching Award from the National Communication Association. And he is currently serving as the co-director for the Media and Diversity Center. Once again, I welcome all of our experts this evening, this panel. I look forward to hearing their comments. They will respond to this prompt, about a 5-minute sort of response. But of course, telling academics they have 5 minutes is like telling pastors they only have a half an hour sermon, or your parents when they want to have a conversation with you, it's only 10 minutes. It could go longer than that, but it's 5 minutes, 5 non-academic minutes, okay? All right, the prompt. From your particular scholarly perspective, how can we think about the events of January 6th and how they impact any or all of the pillars of the Middleton Center, being race, citizenship, and justice? And so I will first throw it off to, we didn't actually decide in order, so I will go on the order list on the flyer. Professor Bailey, I give you the floor.
How did I know that was going to happen?
Sorry.
That is okay. Thank you guys so much for having me here. And I'm not necessarily a scholar, but certainly a veteran journalist, and can speak to the issues that you put forth in your prompt, hopefully in a way that is somewhat intelligent and engaging. That will be my attempt this afternoon. So journalistically, especially as we look at the issues of race, citizenship, and justice, what unfolded last week really, I think, put to the test some things for journalists and for the media as a whole. We have been grappling with some issues concerning the coverage of race, concerning the coverage of the social justice movement, and how we phrase those things, what we call a riot versus a protest versus now an insurrection. And we saw some of that obviously on that date. We saw headlines changing and morphing online as the day went on, to go from a rally to a march, to a protest, to an insurrection, perhaps, to a mob, to a siege. So we saw those things in terms of the media's ability or the media's attempt to grapple with what it was seeing, and as well as what it was experiencing, because the media itself was under attack as well. So from the pillar of race, I would look at it, I would say that we were, that what we can see is, I think, an effort by many media organizations to increase their awareness and their sensitivity to how things are phrased, and also in their reactions. And in the short amount of time, in my opinion, it took for many of them to make the connection that had this been a Black Lives Matter movement, that undoubtedly things would not have gone the way they went, right? So I see it in that terms of citizenship. I've seen some wonderful efforts to try to explain, to make sure people understand what is the difference between words like sedition and a riot, insurrection. What are those things, and why perhaps certain verbiage was or was not used. And then certainly all the way even up to today, what the process would be for a particular move by Congress, covering the reactions, obviously, of all those folks who were involved. And in terms of justice, I think asking pertinent questions about the differences, again, in the way the Black Lives Matter movement would have been treated in this instance, as well as what would justice look like, and getting our lawmakers to go on record and to say publicly what to them justice looks like for those who did this, and for those who may have helped to perpetrate it or helped to inflame the rhetoric. Including from President Donald Trump on to whomever else, what would justice look like for that group of people? What should justice look like for them? And what are the charges or whatnot that they are likely to face? But certainly, I think in all three of those areas, it's been an interesting thing to watch and to be a part of every single day. Was that under 5, I think?
That was actually really good. Clearly not an academic. Thank you, Professor Bailey. Not one who's been to a conference or symposium in quite some time. Thank you. Professor Bowman, you have the floor, sir.
Okay. I am massively unprepared for this, perhaps because what happened last week is all I've been thinking about for the last week or so, and talking about, ceaselessly, to the distress of my wife. She'd like to see me again. Where to start? Maybe the best place to start is actually with for PBS, a mildly heated exchange with former Congressman McCollum on the NewsHour coverage of the impeachment just a few minutes ago. If any of you have been watching the impeachment proceedings in the House all day, you will probably have noted that there was a good deal of effort by at least some of the Republican representatives to equate what happened on the 6th and the rhetoric associated with it with Black Lives Matter protests and other sort of social justice protests over the last year or so. In essence, saying, well, isn't there this sort of, two-sided or rather inconsistency between Democrats wanting to impeach Trump for speech that leads to violence, and some Democrats, in the view of Republicans, inciting violence, or at least not objecting to it as vigorously as they might have in other contexts. And obviously this is a false equivalency, it goes without saying, but it bears thinking about, and certainly it's going to be a problem that's going to plague us going forward as we try to get through and get past the ghastly Trump presidency. What's clear right now is that there's a segment of at least the institutional Republican Party, that even after after nearly being killed by a mob, they simply are unprepared to change their frame of reference in any way. They brought up those kinds of comparisons throughout the day, which I thought, under the circumstances, were kind of were pretty remarkable. They're not. There's a section of the institutional Republican Party in the Trump base that's not going to abandon their framing of this stuff, even under these circumstances, and that's a pretty remarkable thing. Now, obviously, one of the points that was made to varying degrees by the Democrats on the House floor was that there is, a dramatic difference between people, individuals, even groups, trying to achieve social justice objectives, even perhaps through means that we may disapprove of in terms of violence or property destruction, and a concerted effort by a president, his supporters, his enablers in the media, to overturn the results of a free and fair election, culminating in a riot which could not have occurred had Mr. Trump not solicited the attendance of thousands of people to Washington on that day, and brought them there, frankly, for the purpose of trying to intimidate Congress into doing something which it had no constitutional power to do, which is to overturn the results of the election. Those just aren't equivalent things. And it's distressing, I think, to hear people who are elected representatives of all the people to stand up in the House of Representatives and try to excuse what happened not just on last week, because that's really not, in my view, ought not be the focus of the impeachment, but the prolonged effort to reverse the election by Mr. Trump and his supporters. Now, that effort, of course, itself had a significant racial component, obviously. Many of the appeals around the idea that somehow the election had been stolen, while they were very, very rarely framed in expressly racial ways, plainly in many places had racial subtexts that were not very well hidden. After all, where were the places that that Republicans were so prone to complain about, voting, supposed voting irregularities? Well, surprise, tended to be places where minorities populated to a large degree. So, I mean, I'm basically blathering, but let me just conclude with this. Underneath this event, the series of events, remains a resurgence of the kind of thinking that we were unsuccessful in dealing with during Reconstruction. It's engaging in a resurgence now. Now, that's not to say that what's happening with Trump is all racial. It's certainly not. There's a lot more threads to the Trump phenomenon and the sense of grievance that his folks feel, in which they're willing to act on in violent ways. But certainly, there is a racial component to that. It's one we can't escape, and it's one which, based on having to listen to hours of arguments on the floor today, remains only barely beneath the surface and plainly is a poisonous thread in this conversation. The fact that, and this is the last thing I'll say, the fact that 2/3 of the Republican caucus of the House of Representatives was prepared to come back into the House chamber after nearly being killed by rioters and nonetheless vote to try to reject the results of a free and fair election is an almost unbelievable commentary on the state of that party. And this is not to cast aspersions on all Republicans, because that would be absurd. But unfortunately, the Republican Party and this is a truism, but it's also true. It is absolutely essential for the health of a republic like ours that there be an active, vigorous, intelligent, combative, even conservative party. There must be, to counterbalance the inevitable excesses of liberals. A healthy republic requires that. But unfortunately, our modern conservative, the manifestation of our modern conservatism has been so poisoned by a segment of people who plainly are, at least in some measure, influenced by terribly retrograde racial views and are willing to exploit that, is a cancer on our democracy that's going to last, I fear, for a while. My hope when dealing with this impeachment problem was that finally at last the bad guys had overreached to such a degree that, among other things, elements of the Republican Party would be able to cast out or to make a turn, to leave behind the elements of the party that have been so poisonous over the last few years. Certainly after today, I'm less optimistic about that. But I think we're not done. And I think there's some hope that, not just with respect to impeachment, which is a peculiar animal anyway, but that perhaps what happened the other day can become an event which breaks the spell to some degree, which now holds a segment, not only the Republican Party, obviously, but many millions of Americans. And if we can't solve that problem, we can't change the minds, not just of election-seeking Republicans in elected office. If we can't change that problem for millions and millions of Americans, we are in deep, deep trouble as a republic.
Thank you, Professor Bowman. Professor Dow?
First, I want to thank Professor Shonekan and Professor Mitchell for organizing this. This is extraordinarily important, and I think this is exactly the panel to put together some ideas to understand what has happened and what is likely to happen. So I apologize if this seems a little stilted, but I actually wrote down a number of thoughts, and I'm going to refer to them as I talk about this. But from a political science perspective, the big question for us is why such a breakdown in civic and democratic norms? And to echo a little bit about what President Middleton said, this problem wasn't created in the last 20 days or so. This is a problem that has a history that goes back quite a bit, and it's not going to be solved overnight. But when you're talking about widespread belief in conspiracies and alternative facts, an increasing willingness to resort to intimidation and violence to achieve political objectives, I think we do have to step back a little bit and ask why this has developed and where we might look to sort of begin a remedy for this. And from a political science perspective, there are many avenues one can pursue to this question, but I'm going to talk about two that weigh heavily on my mind. And these are going to be on the nature of civic education and also the development of what we might call social capital, the commitment to an ability to function in one's community. So let me start with civic education a little bit. Civic education, and I think the nature of civic education there's been a decline, and we need civic education to create a civic identity. The civic identity encapsulates political and legal equality in the United States, a sense of rights, corresponding civic duties. And this requires a civic education that provides a proper foundation for people to meaningfully participate in their polity. You have to cultivate the idea that government cannot be arbitrary, that it has to be law-driven. Now, in the United States, civic education is traditionally focused on creating a sense of national cohesion. And I think that is very important. Madison, for example, talks about the importance of the veneration of institutions and political institutions. And civic education is a big part of developing that veneration. Now, the education, civic education we need to work with or to develop or to foster needs to be reinvigorated, I think, in a manner that gives full respect to the unvarnished history of the United States, but also strongly emphasizes the ideals and the achievements of the nation that make protecting its civic institutions worthwhile. It needs to be grounded in facts. In the absence of a grounding in facts, in real history, the Constitution, our history, how our government works, et cetera, then all facts become alternative facts. All conspiracies become alternative explanations for things that we see. And that becomes a horrible problem for our nation. So I think this, and an example I would give of this just from the last week or so, which probably made Professor Mitchell and Professor Bowman just roll their eyes, was when Senator Hawley talked about the cancellation of his book contract from Simon & Schuster. And in a tweet someplace, he said, this is a terrible violation of First Amendment protections. Now, in any world where we have a decent civic education, we know that is not true. There are no First Amendment issues raised by that. Unless, of course, Yale Law School is a terribly inferior legal education, but there is no issue.
It is. It's terrible. It stinks.
I apologize for that. But again, in a world of strong, fact-based, rigorous civic education, these things don't get by. And there are a lot of people who honestly believe that there are First Amendment issues associated with these type of things. This will come up in the discussion of a lot of things that we talk about. The second thing that crossed my mind with respect to this is something that has been identified by political scientists for a long time. In fact, a former American Political Science Association president by the name of Robert Putnam wrote a very, very important book about this, is what he calls declining social capital in the United States. And what he's talking about is our declining ability to function as good citizens in this country. And one of the things that he sort of gives credence to is that we have become such that we engage a lot less in face-to-face organizations and face-to-face enterprises, mostly secular, although the religious organizations are extraordinarily important here, but that would give us the skills and the ability to see the world from a larger perspective, to understand the nature of how government works, how our communities work, and to understand lives that are different than our own. These organizations teach us about governance through their own governance. For example, I am a member of a local Rotary organization. We spent our last meeting working on our bylaws. That is the kind of civic training that helps us understand more about how political processes work. And this has been in decline for some time. A lot of these organizations tend to be philanthropic. They are deeply engaged in their communities in a variety of different ways. And again, this has positive effects. These things have positive effects that spill over from sort of the immediate benefits of being involved in these kinds of organizations, these kinds of groups, to help us understand the political world, both in terms of a broader horizon for understanding the political world, but better skills like civic education better skills for engaging the political world. So it's not such a mystery, that you don't feel so isolated from the political process and things of that nature. So those are the two things that I think are really worth exploring if we're looking beyond the immediacy of the moment and going to questions about how does this develop over time and where do we need to put our emphasis to remedy the problems that we have been experiencing. Again, I want to, I'll close by just simply pointing to one of the constant themes in founding era political thought. One of the themes that Madison emphasizes is the importance of the veneration of these types of institutions. And I deeply fear we're losing that veneration, and the social consequences of that, the political consequences are very troubling. And with that, I'll end.
Thank you, Professor Dow. Appreciate it. Professor Graves.
Wonderful. Thanks again, everybody, for having me and for putting on this wonderful, wonderful event. I'm definitely proud to represent the Department of Black Studies in this conversation. As I think about the events of last week, I want to separate it from the importance of the current events of the second impeachment and try to separate this argument or the discussion really from President Trump being in the idea that he really just has provided a symbol or an emblem really for an idea or for concepts that were already kind of present in America or have been for a very long time. And so when I think about the present day and what I really witnessed last week, I really think about, again, why did this happen, and come to the conclusion that white Americans are angry, and they have been angry for a very long time. And I think that when we talk about this idea of alternative facts, I think that one of the things is that really highlights their anger is this idea of two Americas that African Americans have been speaking about, obviously for a very long time. And this goes back to the idea and the very founding of this country, which was based on this idea of alternative facts when they talked about human equality and, of course, disregarded African Americans and then qualified them as humans in order to receive the privileges of citizenship and justice and equality and everything else it is. So we started out with this idea of a kind of fallacy and an illusion surrounding, a country and what it was going to be founded on. But most importantly, about the importance of this white anger that we're really seeing. And this has happened throughout history. Again, you think about the anger of the Civil War, and they were angry when they wanted to free the slaves. They were angry during Reconstruction when they wanted to, give them 40 acres and a mule. They were angry during industrialization, and they wanted to equalize the military and the workforce. And they were angry during civil rights when they wanted to give them votes and access to education and everything else it is. They were angry in 2008 when they elected the first Black president as well. So I think what all these things demonstrate, I think, is white anger when it comes to the progress, any form of progress that African Americans or minorities in this country place or advance, mainly due to this idea that the country for which they believe in and that they believe was founded was one that placed them at the top and at a place of privilege for which all other ethnic groups would be subject to. And this can be pointed out in not only in the ideas of our founding fathers, but in the actions they took and the ideas that they expressed when you're talking about what was to happen to the Africans after slavery was over. And from Lincoln to Jefferson on down the line, the idea was like they were not meant to stay here in America, right? They were going to purchase colonized lands across in other places. And then the idea was that to ship Africans and ship the slaves somewhere else. De Tocqueville noted the same thing in Democracy in America. What is going to happen when you free these slaves and what the country is going to make? Jefferson saying the same thing. The idea was that this constitutional democracy and the founding fathers and thus as a default, white Americans, as they look to the founding fathers of this pillar of American democracy, they had no intent on this democracy treating African Americans and minorities as equal partners, as equal citizens, and worthy of equal justice. And then as we have noticed that these trends of equality as we have pushed, and progress is the term that I will use lightly, what you're seeing is this wide practice of political ideology is that they see it as a zero-sum game, and any progress made by minorities must mean that's chipping away at the progress or the privilege of whites. And in every new election, as the browning of America takes place and the ideas become more progressive, and the racial landscape and demographics of the country continue to change, whites see more and more of this country slipping away from the country from which they believe in, the one that they were always taught about, the one that their parents always read to them about, and the one that they really want to live in ideally. And so this anger from what we're seeing from them in this instance, I think just culminates from what has been a traditional practice. And one of the problems, of course, has been noted as kind of as an unsolvable problem and an onus. And many a times that this onus has been pushed on, African Americans, the minority, to kind of open a door to become, assimilated culturally wise in order to kind of ease this progress. But I think one thing that we are witnessing now, and that what's really highlighted in last week, is that this is not an issue that African Americans can fix. The moral framework and fabric, if you would like to call it that, of this country is not one that is going to be at the responsibility of African Americans. This anger and where it's to be guided and where it is to be placed is one that has to be internally discussed and recognized amongst the white American majority. And that will be a very important aspect if we're talking about, kind of solving this problem in the current discussion of healing. And healing is an important element that we continue to hear about. But in this country, we're talking about the experience of African Americans in particular. There hasn't been healing that is taking place even from the 500 plus years of injustice that's currently being experienced. So we haven't been able to even heal from those wounds, let alone be able to pile on the 500 years of wounds that has been experienced by other demographics and other minorities, from women to Hispanic, Native Americans, and what people will call even currently. And so when you're talking about what's going to be needed, the kind of interaction, the kind of social fabric that needs to take place in this country to have some kind of healing, what we have continually noticed, again, to get back to the original point about responsibility and accountability in this division, is that whites have continually showed them that they have no interest really, or don't really have a want in actually to participate equally and unbiasedly in any healing project that would bring justice or any kind of equitable healing to the problems that African Americans face when you're talking about race and racism and institutional racism.
Thank you, Professor Graves. Professor Gregory?
Thank you. And I am going to turn on share screen. And while doing so, I want to just say thank you to Professor Mitchell and to Professor Shonekan for setting this up so quickly. And screen sharing working? Yes? We're good. All right. I am going to try and watch the time and also talk you through some images. I first want to acknowledge what religious studies is and what we do. It's not something everybody always thinks about. We try to study religion from an objective perspective that is not a neutral perspective. And so I encourage each of you, as I am going through what I'm about to show you, to try and set aside your own views on what happened last week and just watch again and think about what you're seeing and think about the refrains you're hearing and think about how others in this country might view things differently than you do. I want to begin with an acknowledgement of the journalistic work and the threats to journalism that are happening in this nation and that were at a peak last week. We would not know what was happening, what has happened, if not for journalists doing their jobs in a place where they were being directly attacked. First image on the slide shows an attack on journalistic equipment by participants at the rally. Also to remind us all of the timing of what happened. The Georgia election, the election of a Black and a Jewish senator, to not let this be overshadowed by what happened. And to remind you all also that it was Epiphany, that it was Orthodox Christmas. And to then, I'm going to try and talk through quickly. I want to just stress before I start that we need to deny the binary language of religion in America, to stop talking about us and them, the two parties, to talk about the patriot and the insurrectionist, and to pay attention to the nuances and the breadth of ways of being, both in this country and in the state and at that rally. And what happened in the Capitol building will make more sense if you remember that there are people who are your neighbors who believe what they believed, and who won't trust me or anyone else who tells them that what they see as facts are not true. So I'll quickly touch on a couple of things: race, citizenship, justice. I think all feed into what I wanted to talk about, because in America, who can be a citizen is not just linked to race, it's also linked to religion. And anything from Trump's Muslim ban to the prioritizing of Buddhist and Shinto priests when Japanese Americans were interred at the beginning of American involvement in World War II. The ways in which whiteness in America is linked to Protestant identity are critical to understanding what's happened and what is happening. On the terms of justice, I want to stress justice needs to be fair, it needs to be equal, and it can't just be the prison system. And on the subject of citizenship, I will have a lot more to say. But I want to say too that we can't have unity before we have restitution. We can have peace before we have restitution, but we can't have unity. So I want to just discuss briefly the image on the slide showing gathering of supporters of President Trump who had walked away from the rally towards Capitol Hill, gathering in prayer. Because one thing that you may not have thought about is how predominant images of Christian worship were in the attack on the Capitol building. And so to introduce a way of thinking about what's going on, I want to talk about two categories of religion in America. One, what some scholars are calling Christian nationalism. Andrew Whitehead has a new book out on this. And the other, what sociologist of religion Robert Bellah called civil religion in America. The idea of civil religion in America actually echoes something that Professor Dow was talking about, the veneration of institutions. And from a textbook, a concise definition, a religious system that has existed alongside churches. If you've ever turned in a classroom to pledge allegiance to the flag, if you've ever noted the calendar and the holidays that we celebrate, the idea that there are symbols, that there are rituals, the veneration for the flag, the entire Capitol site as sacred, but not explicitly religious, is a large part of what America is about. So I want you to think for a second about what you see when you drive through Missouri, if you happen to be in Missouri, and to think and to realize that some of the Missouri politicians and some of the Missouri voters who are being maligned right now are also very much identifying as Christian. Our own Josh Hawley, Senator, has written extensively about how his views on Christian theology and the expectation of the end of the world shape his politics. So if you think about what you see when you drive through Missouri, and I'm sorry, the slide's out of order. When I was driving home last week, listening to NPR as the rally became an attack on a building that then became a riot and something more, I saw Trump flags. I saw thin blue line flags. I saw American flags. And I got home and turned on the television and I saw the same flags that I'd seen on my drive home on the television. And I want to just highlight some ways in which religion was present at the rally. These are scenes of blowing the shofar from the Jericho March movement. Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president. Several other images here relate to political rather than religious claims. Number of flags here, including the Appeal to Heaven flag, which is the green and white flag. Jordan Klepper from Comedy Central actually interviewed somebody who has one of these. It's a symbol of Christian nationalism. Another one reading God, Country, and Notre Dame. Before the attack began, members of the Proud Boys knelt in prayer. Recordings of their prayer include decrying of socialism. And I can't actually read what's on my slide, but I think you can. Sorry, screen share did not work there. But right before they began, they were praying. And multiple accounts of staffers barricaded behind doors also describe attackers in prayer. You can see an image of a Jesus flag framing the attack on that glass, which you may have also seen from the other side of the door, paralleling the Trump flag, anti-Semitic poster decrying circumcision, which is not as obviously anti-Semitic as some of those Auschwitz and Holocaust and Nazi symbols, but still very much is. And then the image of the so-called Q shaman, who has been the face of this protest, a way of trying very hard to not admit that most of the people at the protest were not him. that most of the people of the protest were easily our neighbors, were in fact white Christian Protestants in prayer, a large number of them. His red, white, and blue face paint, his dress, his potentially white nationalist or heathen symbols on his body. We've talked about all of them, but we haven't talked about the American flag that he's holding. And we haven't talked about why his face is the one that is being used to talk about the protests rather than any of these others. So citizenship, who can be an American and who can't? This was shared earlier today on Twitter, a handwritten note of the good guys and the bad guys. I have tried really hard not to give too much attention in my visual presentation to acts of violence, but it's worth noting that this was a list of people who were going to be targets of violence, and one of the only 2 Muslims in the House of Representatives is specifically categorized here, pulled out. And this goes back to the idea of who is an American. How many of us are hyphenated or asterisked Americans who are asked, where are you really from? What is your real identity? And how many people are just American? So I'm going to wrap up my images by saying, this is us. I've heard all week, this is not us. That these people are outliers, that what happened is an aberration. I don't know how many of you remember the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, or this image that went on to win so many awards of an Oklahoma City firefighter, Chris Fields, holding the young Bailey Ullman, only 1 year old, often described as an American Pietà. She died the next day. And what can we say about what happened at Oklahoma City? And what can we say about the lessons we haven't learned about militia movements, about white nationalism, about the idea of America as part of God's plan? The mistake, I would say, is to assume that this is not us. And I want to just quickly end with a couple of mentions of statements from elected representatives last week. Trump, the speech that he gave that invited his rally attendees to march towards the Capitol building, ended with a refrain that I think anyone who follows American politics has heard many times before. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you and God bless America. Thank you all for being here. And then they begin their march. Later that day, in a tweet that got him permanently banned from Twitter, he called his election victory, quote, a sacred landslide. Later that evening, members of the elected body were talking about religion, but they were talking about American civil religion. Pelosi talked about the gleeful desecration of this, our temple of democracy. Mike Pence in these hallowed halls, even in the wake of unprecedented violence and vandalism. He goes on, so may God bless the lost, the injured, the heroes forged on this day. May God bless all who serve here and those who protect this place, and may God bless the United States of America. Chuck Schumer, this temple to democracy was desecrated, its windows smashed, our offices vandalized. So I don't want to go on too much more about this, but I do want to say that this isn't a battle of 2 different religions. This is a battle over what America is. There is no disagreement about which symbols are sacred. The flag is sacred. The Constitution is sacred. The only disagreement is who is a traitor and who is a patriot. And I can say a lot more about how education and the language of myth and being aware of our neighbors might help solve some of these problems, but I know we're going to have a conversation, so I'll save some of that for the Q&A. But yeah, think about who is a hero, who is a traitor. We don't agree on that, and many people still believe that it was an act of patriotism to attack the Capitol last week, and we need to reckon with that and think about it.
Thank you, Professor Gregory. Professor Riles?
So yes, I'd like to just start off by echoing the gratitude to Professor Shonekan Mitchell for putting this together. I'm honored to be part of this important critical discussion. I'm also honored to be representing the Department of Communication and the Media and Diversity Center, where tons of amazing work is going on that teases much of what I'm going to talk about right now. So while, of course, the events of last week could be deemed quite unexpected to many, in another sense, they were far from unexpected in a number of ways. Starting first with, I can speak about how they were unexpected in both a specific sort of situational sense, but also how they were not really unexpected in more of a general or academic sense. And so in the specific situational sense, one thing that we've seen in the aftermath is that this event, this riot, this insurrection was planned openly over the course of several weeks. It was planned in the sense of on various threads like the Donald, the replacement subreddit for Trump supporters, or even the Stop the Steal organization, as far back as, when we went on winter break, they were talking about, yes, we're looking forward to doing this. And if anyone tries to give us any resistance, we're going to take it up a notch and we're going to get violent. I mean, these things were not really said extremely coyly or shyly. They were put out there for many people to see. And of course, this can be contrasted with the social justice movement of earlier in 2020, where those things were not associated with the movement. And yet, and still, we see the stark divergences in how community and law enforcement decided to prepare for those events. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the institutional biases that have led to something like this? What are the institutional prejudices that have led to these two different reactions, even in a situation where it isn't wholly unexpected? There is evidence that this is coming. Why are there these two different reactions? And this is where I get to the more general or academic aspect that was not unexpected. Myself being someone who studies mediated communication, I'm a media psychologist, we look at how can media play a role in causing these divergent actions, even in more or less congruent situations that differ by race, ethnicity, or other social identity. One thing that we know from this research is that within media generally, commercial media especially, but also entertainment and for to a very large extent news media, we see these racialized distortions, not just race, but also basically what I'll describe as hegemony-based portrayals, distortions that are serving a function and that have these consequences that we see, like in last week. So I say this has to do with commercial media, because within commercial media, what is the goal is to get eyes, get people to view, to be interested, to come back. And it's hard to do that when you're presenting images of people to themselves as perpetrators of these crimes, as these malevolent actors, right? And so because of this, we tend to see that things like undocumented immigration in the news overwhelmingly is talked about in terms of Latino, Latina. Terrorism in the news overwhelmingly discussed in terms of Arab Muslims, when both of those things are vast distortions. Really, it's the hegemonic majority that tends to do both of those things more often, at least racial or ethnically speaking. We see things like Black people over time have been shown as disproportionately as criminals, and it's especially disproportionate when the crime is more severe. And that all along, who are the law enforcement or holders of law tends to be the white majority. So then it follows that when you're presented with a more or less congruent situation, riot, protests, that for one group you're going to say, let's prepare for the worst, danger's on its way, and for the other you're going to give the benefit of the doubt because they're the upholders. That's the world that's been presented to us over and over in this commercial media environment that works because it keeps the most people coming back. But it also lays the foundation for these entrenched stereotypes that lead to these automatic prejudicial attitudes and therefore discriminatory behaviors as a function of the environment that we're in and how our environment will talk about different types of people doing similar things. We saw this a decade and a half ago with Hurricane Katrina. A lot of us saw some of the reporting on that where white couple, they were finding food, black couple, they were black young kid, adolescent, was looted, doing the same behavior. Well, how then, when ethnicity is framed in that way, could there not be an eventual outcome in terms of societal reactions to, again, more or less, or what can be considered more or less congruent behaviors? In this case, I wouldn't consider the protests from the summer and now to be congruent, but in the sense of them being protests and one resulting in police action and the other resulting in police selfies with the protesters, we have to look at why those automatic associations exist in the first place. And the media landscape is most definitely one source of that.
Thank you, Professor Riles. Wow, you have all given us, and I appreciate all your comments because you have given us a great deal to think about. There are a number of threads that come out of last week. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. However, I will ask if my fellow co-director has a question. It takes a little moderator prerogative. I can, of course, ask one because I always have questions to ask. I'd love to have individual conversation with each of you, quite honestly, on the things that you have raised. There's one question in the chat that I'm going to try to raise and frame it in a broader way, but I will offer it first to my co-director if she has a question to throw out there for the conversation. Stephanie?
Thank you, David. Incredible. I think the Middleton Center really was created for this kind of discourse. And you're right, David, we could actually have this happen at a roundtable, bring them back for part 2, because there's just so much that we can unpack here. So I guess my question, which all of you made me think about this, we're professors, and my question is inspired by what Jay said about education, right? So a lot of what has happened is because of a breakdown of civic education, probably in K-12. It starts there, but it continues in at the university level. So a lot of what has happened have been misconceptions, as Julius said, stereotypes that have been built over a period of time for generations. As Stephen said, this is not new. This is not a surprise. It's something that has been building for a long time. So for you all, I'm thinking of Ruby in the J School. How do you teach? What are our challenges as professors to enter this space? I think a lot of the questions that we're getting are questions about how do we fix this? And we can't do everything, but we are professors. So if each of you could just give, or it doesn't even have to be all of you, but if a couple of you could help us think about that. Ruby, you want to start? Once again.
That's okay. That's okay. So certainly in the J School and at the Columbia Missourian, which functions as a lab for the J School, one of the things that we are doing, or one of the things that we are really trying very hard to do is to help our students think and to understand context and to understand life experience and some of the history that they're seeing that they're now trying to live out, and to be able to understand those things and to understand, I guess, just basically what the history of this country. And as you said, Stephanie, when they may not have had a very robust history background, right? So they may not understand some things that were going on in history, or a very robust life experience. So I think for us, certainly certain journalistic principles that we apply, including fairness. And as we wrestle with, as an industry, with what objectivity is, what neutrality is, what balance is, how to be fair, how to be fair, how to be accurate, how to make sure that what we say is true. Some of the things that Julius has touched on so wonderfully. We have to continue to look very hard at ourselves and understand the voices that we amplify and the power that we give through both our words and our images. So it is a lot of conversation, but it is a lot of showing through example, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what we sometimes do, and obviously also having a way of being transparent and being and being accountable to our audiences. and listening to those audiences and making sure that there's a process in place where we allow folks to talk to us as well, and that we see ourselves as servants of the community, that we serve our communities, that we have a responsibility to them, that our responsibility is not to get a story or to get a byline, but it is to tell the stories, right, fully and completely in a robust way. Was that less than 5 minutes?
Yes, it was, my dear sister. Stephen, do you want to say a few things, or Rabia? Either one of you, fine.
I will just touch on real quick as far as the role of in higher education and for us as professors. I think that one of the most important things that we can do and we have shown is that we've got to get back to some discussion with our students as far as normative critical thinking. And one of the areas, especially when we're talking politically, is we have allowed in so many arenas for the rhetoric and for the discussion to be moved away from intellectual discussions and into pundits, and from everyone else to be able to offer and provide political opinions. And the experts have retired and moved into academia, for which the kind of normative, non-quantifiable statistical analysis for which we have become prone to has kind of left the political arena. And I think in some of these instances that the public needs political expertise and political knowledge more than ever. And that sometimes can be the role, and it should be the role of political experts. And in regards to the responsibilities we have to our students, it's not our job necessarily to teach them what to think, but in how to think comes a certain responsibility to corrective and to disallow certain schools of thought and parameters around certain aspects of knowledge that should not be necessarily promoted and condoned in such high regard as in some cases they find themselves currently being. And so we can help our students out by continually emphasizing that kind of intellectual virtue. And as educators, we can get back into public service in ways for which we can enter the conversation, for which we can allow some of this alternative facts to be disengaged with actual political expertise and knowledge.
May I now?
Go ahead, Rabia.
I think about this often because it's why I teach religious studies. This sense of urgency that vulnerable minorities, political stability, the future of our nation is shaped by how we teach people to think about difficult questions, things that can't have only one answer, things that can't fit into a multiple choice question. And since we are a public university, the work the center is doing is so critical to not just doing that in the classroom, but doing it for the state and doing it for the public, modeling how to listen with empathy, how to disagree without becoming violent. And so I would say two things. One is that we as teachers need to listen. We need to listen even when we disagree, because we have to understand where our students are coming from. And two, that we need to advocate for an educational reform of sorts in terms of the kinds of things that students are taught before they get to the university. Whether it is information about the history and the founding of this nation and having a much broader narrative of where America comes from and who can be an American, or how students are taught, teaching to a test versus, having a debate. And then finally, we need to model those of us who feel safe doing so. And that is really important. I want to acknowledge that not everybody can do this safely. Some of us are much more vulnerable to attacks than others, right? But those of us who feel safe doing so need to model dialogue. We need to be willing to be a little bit vulnerable, to move from sort of a version of always saying this is what I think and I'm an expert so I'm right, to being hospitable, to opening up a place for conversation and modeling how to do that. Just a thought.
Yeah, and if I could briefly add on to that, I would say that in my field, one of the main things that we are often advocating both in our classes and even outside of the classes, media literacy education, in order to help kind of deal with these very concerns. Specifically with media literacy education, it involves things like, unlearning certain biases that you have, or at least being able to question them as they come about, but also learning various skills such as, for example, learning how to be okay with the discomfort that may come along with being exposed to certain pieces of information or even entertainment. There's a big idea within media psychology of positive distinctiveness, the idea that when people who remind us of us do well, we feel better, and when they do worse, we feel worse. Well, trying to unlearn that connection so that when you hear about someone that reminds you of yourself doing something in this way historically or even in modern times, that you can still grapple with that and not just tune out, not just decide to selectively expose yourself to something else that will make you feel better about who you are, not seeking out affirmation over information. And so I would say, yeah, media literacy is something that we often advocate should be kind of taught before even literacy, regular literacy, because of how early people are exposed to media and the distortions within.
So I'm gonna pull a couple questions together from the Q&A from our listening audience and to throw it out there. I'm gonna try to combine it so that it's all relevant. It's relevant for each of you in this context. So the question is that the individuals who stormed the Capitol last week, firmly believe that they are saving the country, that they are potentially reclaiming symbols, that they're viewing it through a particular religious lens, right? That they are engaging in this veneration, right? That we are reclaiming that which is their America. And so the question that was posed is fundamentally, how do you address a group of individuals who so fervently believe that they are acting upon what is their inherent duty to save the country for last week's events, but also looking forward to where we are right now, thinking about the transition to next week, right? Because right now, quite honestly, we are at the midpoint between the insurrection and the inauguration. And part of that question was, how do we prepare as a campus, as a city, for individuals who are these fervent believers in this particular savior ideology of saving the country?
I jump in a little bit on this, although I don't know that I have anything to say in particular about the campus. The basic problem that you're posing, David, is something that I've been thinking about a lot, because it is plainly true that the people who stormed the Capitol, there may have been a few, cynics and opportunists, but I think the vast majority of them believed that they were there to save democracy from a nefarious plot to steal it. And I will tell you that if I believed the same thing, I might have been there with them, right? If Trump's efforts, for example, to convince the Secretary of State of Georgia to change the votes had been successful, if Trump had managed to strong-arm Vice President Pence to do something contrary to his constitutional duty, and somehow or other Congress would have accepted that, I'd take to the streets. You're talking here about, it's easy to look at the crazy people wearing the stupid horns and the body tattoos and all that and just dismiss them as nuts. And they were, a lot of them, nuts. But if you look inside the thing from their perspective, what they did makes a good deal of sense. If Trump had succeeded, I don't approve of their methods and all that sort of stuff, but if Trump had succeeded actually in maintaining himself in office through some combination of threats, propaganda, coercion of Congress or whatever, we would have had a genuine civil war. And I'd be out there carrying my modern version of a musket. I get it. If I believed as they do, I might have been there. And that's a huge problem for all of us. Moreover, but the only point I want to make about this, stemming from sitting through the impeachment hearing today, and it actually circles around to the thing I started talking about, the fight I got in with former Congressman McCollum and never really got around to, is they believe that stuff, in part, of course, because they're fed that by sort of fringe media or media silos that they inhabit, including Fox, but also far crazier places than that. But all of the stuff that they hear on the media has been validated by their elected leadership. People whom, in an American democracy, you ought to be able to trust. The President of the United States, if he tells you that he believes that the election's been stolen, that in fact millions of votes have been stolen, and he's a guy whose values and policies you support, and for reasons God knows why, but you've actually come to believe and trust this man. If he tells you that this is the truth, and he's not contradicted by the other members of his party who know better, then it's hardly surprising that at least some segment of the population is going to believe it fervently, and that at least a larger segment of the population is going to continue to entertain worries about this. And what was astonishing about the debate today on the floor, and also the conversation I had with Congressman McCollum on NewsHour, was institutional Republicans. Some of them are continuing, a lot of them have backed away now, but at least some of them on that floor today were continuing to cast doubt, at least a little bit, some more than others, on the validity of the election, in the usual Trumpian language of, well, people have questions we need to address. The classic Josh Hawley excuse for standing up on the floor of the Senate and in some respects setting in train the series of events that we see. A large part of the responsibility, not all of it, of course, because it's this terrible interlocking mix of media sources, of other social, inputs and effects, but all of them being ratified by governmental officials and party officials and people whom, in a former era, you would have reasonably expected to speak the truth, at least to the best they knew it. And our particular tragedy and our particular danger right now is that we have a large segment of the people and institutions whom we have traditionally trusted to promote truth and to ensure that the populace at large is generally in line with reality. They've signed up for all this crazy stuff. They've given validation to all the fear. And it's a problem in part of the leadership class. And I'm dumping it all on the folks on the right. I'm sure there are left-wing analogs of all races. None of us, and no segment of the population or the political spectrum is entirely immune from this. But I think you have to look, to some extent, straight at the political leadership class. When I speak about the insurrection the other day, the rioting, I think it is not, for me, an exaggeration to say that in many ways I blame some of the people who were on the inside of that building a good deal more than I blame the people who are on the outside of the building. It was their responsibility not to have created the environment in which that was possible. And they did, and the tragedy of today is that too many of them refused to repudiate it.
If I might build on a few things Professor Bowman has said, there's a couple aspects of this that are very difficult, as I think you said, intertwined and hard to wrap our minds around. But one of the things that's interesting about this is those that storm the Capitol, or those that are sort of the strong Trump supporters, maintain the use of the language of democracy. In other words, the election was stolen. It wasn't that elections don't matter. There have been a couple of politicians, mostly minor state officials in a couple of places, who have said, I don't care what the election says, what matters is the outcome. But the language has been that the election was stolen, the voting machines are rigged, or something like that. And if we could only get the election process correct, then things would have been okay. And I just think that's an interesting observation, that language is still maintained. And this brings me then to the responsibility of people in positions of authority, elected officials, and so on. The danger of populism, one of the dangers of populism is you have to say things as that you know are not true, that you absolutely know are not true. And if you think of someone like Senator Hawley, for example, he knows the election was not rigged. He knows that they lost a free and fair election, and that's just the end of the story there. But you have to say things that you know are not true, such as, you know, Simon & Schuster has violated my First Amendment rights by pulling a contract or something like that. And so the question becomes, how do you make populist appeals of that sort less viable, where people can stand up and say, you're just factually wrong, and be convincing to a large enough people that you cannot get purchase in that direction. I'll come back to civic education as my hobby horse, I guess, of the evening, is one of those things that makes that sort of appeal less popular or less possible. But that kind of populism, I think, is a real danger to our political system. It has all sorts of nefarious effects beyond just creating what we've been seeing over the last several years or last several weeks. And so I think that's one of the places as scholars we need to turn some attention to, that somehow addresses both the reception, the receptivity of people to populist appeals and the incentives to make them. The other thing that I will point out, if we're looking for little silver linings and things, and there are very, very little silver linings, but a couple of us have done quick eyeball surveys of those who voted for the review of the Electoral College votes in Arizona and Pennsylvania. And one of the things that you notice about the representatives some representatives voted for both, some representatives voted for one or the other, some representatives voted for none, is there seemed to be a pretty clear correlation between the competitiveness of the districts and the voting patterns. The representatives, Ann Wagner would be an example, who are in more competitive districts, did not vote for these, whereas those who are in safer districts, safe Republican districts, were much more likely to vote for them. There's going to be a shakeup of the political landscape after the reapportionment coming up takes place. None of us are going to know exactly what that is going to look like, but there is some hope that with the redistricting process and the reapportionment process, and then followed by the redistricting process, that some of the incentives for representatives to behave in the manner that we've been seeing over the last few weeks might dissipate a little bit. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what it's going to look like, but the political chessboard is going to be reset to a large degree in the next year or two. So with that, I'll stop.
So David, can we go to one of the other questions?
Yep.
On this, because I think this is such a big issue, and it's quite global. I mean, so the globe is watching, and the world is watching. So this question is the East African nation, and I've been following news of Uganda, and it's so interesting that as I read that news of Uganda, it seemed very familiar to what happened here last week. So the question is, the East African nation of Uganda goes to the polls tomorrow. The atmosphere is one of severe repression of presidential candidates by the incumbent President Museveni, who has been in office for 35 years. The outcome is almost a foregone conclusion. Can the US, after what the world watched last week, can the US still be a credible observer and critic of elections around the world, especially in the global South? And maybe Jay and Stephen, this is a question for you guys.
Well, I guess I'll start, sure. And I will start off by saying no. The idea of American democracy being the shiny pillar and being on the hill for which all other democracies and representative governments can be judged and measured up against, I think is troubling. Especially in other countries, especially African countries and Southern Pole countries. I think that one thing that is important to highlight is that one thing Americans can do is watch in hopes of learning and from the experiences that other countries are experiencing as we try to deal with our own issues and our own problems. The idea of America coming in and being some judge for which they are able to decide or to decipher what's a fair running election and how democratic processes should be installed and practiced in other countries. I think that ship has kind of sailed.
I'm going to agree with Professor Graves, maybe not quite as strongly, but it's certainly the case that the American image in this regard has been greatly compromised. And it does make it less possible for us to sort of present ourselves as that example, that exemplar country right now. I think this is damage that can be repaired over time. But right now, I think it is one of those things where we're not going to be in a position to, again, as I say, serve as that exemplar to the rest of the world.
I will just jump in real quick on that. That kind of goes along those same lines, though, when we're thinking of progress and what we can kind of look forward to in these elections and for the future of American representative democracy is the angst and the protests that we're seeing amongst young people as well. I think that the fact that we've got dueling protesting groups in this country, is even as angry and as despotic some of the things that we're seeing amongst white Americans are, it's in some ways comforting to see that there is another group in this country as well who is dissatisfied with the progress and the ways that the American country is going as a whole. And they are also angry in everything else it is. And I think when we're thinking about progress in the future shape, I think that and where academics and where we come in as higher education comes in is in guiding those and to helping those ideas of those young people who are also dissatisfied. And we have a lot of those students in our classrooms, and some of the things that we're seeing or notice is that their perspectives and their wants and needs and how they're going to vote are going to change. A lot of the rhetoric that we're seeing around socialism and things and universal healthcare. I mean, some of our students have been to these other countries and studied abroad, whereas my parents didn't go out of the country the first time until they were in the military. So things like socialism and those scary words were one thing for them. These kids have been to Portugal, have been to some of these places before and spent time in the Netherlands. They've seen universalized healthcare and they've seen 15-year-olds drinking wine at dinner or lunch at noon. And they're not scared off by those things. And they're not voting scared for those things. And so that the frustration of young people in combination with the frustration that you're seeing by a white dominant majority is comforting for anybody who is into or is looking for to be wide sweeping change. If you're just frustrated and done with the status quo and politics as usual, and even the rhetoric as usual, if you're looking for any kind of drastic changes, then this is an opportunity for where you have competing, dueling, angry groups for which at least it is possible to see some level of drastic change and the end of the perpetuation of the status quo.
All right, so we have one final question, and we're going to be wrapping up soon. But I'm trying to combine a couple questions in there from the Q&A. So earlier it was mentioned, of course, the issue.
Just before we do the question,
yep.
A quick announcement that we've been told that one of the buildings at Mizzou, where our administrator is, that building may lose power at 6. So if that happens,
you may end early.
It's not a conspiracy. It just happened that way. But hopefully it will stay on for this last question. So go ahead, David.
And that last question goes to that very point. So there are a couple questions in the chat. One talking about politicians speaking to their own bases and not wanting to cross lines because of potential electoral suicide. And it was in reference to Professor Bowman's book. But the larger question is the concern about Simon & Schuster, about Facebook, about Twitter, about social media, by those individuals banning voices. Are we therefore fundamentally, or should we be concerned about that? And are we further enhancing or creating silos and echo chambers where such basically individuals can only hear the reverberations of their own thought and not be exposed to others, such that we do get January 6th, not just once, but this becomes now the norm?
So I can jump in there and at least say from my perspective, a lot of what I see, of course, there are platforms out there that are ideologically based or based in some way in a set of values. What I tend to see more so from a lot of these mainstream outlets and even politicians is the same thing that we've always seen, which is political expediency. which is to say, whether it be for Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, once the messages create a circumstance in which your brand is tarnished, now it's a problem. I'm not necessarily, at least at this stage, convinced that the way that things are being shut off and quote unquote siloed in that way is for ideological reasons so much as they are for commercial reasons. And so this is also how we saw various secretaries resigning with like a week left to go. Well, it's probably better for your political prospects and your term's almost up anyway. And so I tend to see a lot of political expediency rather than ideologically driven, at least on the part of the platforms. I tend to see that's how they're kind of thinking about this.
Let me just say in response to that, David, that I think one of the people maybe two of the people we would need to help us answer this question are Larissa Litsky, our dean, who is of course a First Amendment scholar of considerable national prominence, and for that matter, Tom Lambert, who is a leading antitrust scholar in this country. Because there's an intersection of these two problems that I don't presume to understand outside of my bailiwick. I just worry about what happened in 1787 and 1788, and after that, I don't care.
I'd also throw in our other free speech person, Chris Wells, but yes.
Right, or Chris, yeah, for sure. But because I am troubled. I mean, I'm more than happy to see, Trump forced into more official venues and avenues of communication and some response to the torrent of untruths. Yeah. And if we were talking about a world in which there's a sort of a very wide array of information transmission mechanisms of more or less equal size and penetration, and one or more of them as private entities want us to say, no, we're not going to publish that stuff from you, Mr. President. That's one thing. But if what we're talking about is an information universe where, the principal mechanisms of at least direct communication, which have been established, between, Facebook and Twitter and these places, where a vast number of Americans seem to derive the primary source of information. If in that world, we hand de facto control over communication from public figures to the national audience, and they get to decide based on their own commercial imperatives, at least as a citizen, that kind of worries me. It's being used against a guy I deplore right now. What's to say that the reverse doesn't happen? And so this is one point, at least, where I have some considerable sympathy with some of the angst being expressed by Mr. Trump supporters or others on the right. I don't profess to have an answer to that because I don't know much, certainly nothing at all about antitrust, and or frankly, the mechanics of internet communication. But that's a place where those things intersect.
So I think David is going to close us out, but I did want to say thank you to each and every panelist. I'm thinking about something Rabia said about our responsibility as professors, and this idea of how to be hospitable when we disagree. And I hope that that's a sentiment that we carry through our conversations this spring in the Middleton Center, is to invite views that go against what our worldview is, and what our particular individual beliefs are. I think that we each and every one of us take that into the classroom as well. And then lastly, I'll just say that the idea, David and Frank have plugged a few of the professors in law. So I will plug all the professors in ANS who every day walk into the classroom, whether they're in the humanities, the social sciences, the sciences and the hard sciences as well, and the arts, and ask our students to consider that other value that Mizzou stands for. It's on our website, and that value is respect. And when the University of Missouri define that, we define it as figuring out that there is not one truth, that there are multiple truths, and we need to contend with all of them. So I'll hand it back to David, and again say thank you to all our panelists and to Michael Middleton, who has stayed with us this whole 90 minutes. David?
Sure. Thank you, Stephanie. Once again, I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank certainly our viewing audience who tuned in for these 90 minutes of us discussing something which I think many of us watched last week and placed us in a position of uncertainty, really sort of trying to figure out what was going on. Well, what I think is really special about this group, and what I think is special about these conversations, is that there are a number of different threads here, right, in which you could have extended conversations. All right, because quite honestly, without the visual images that Rabia had presented, I don't think I saw as explicitly the religious thread that wove its way through the protests, right? Without hearing about the communication pieces, right? How this was sort of, if you will, impacted and influenced a group of individuals. And Stephen Graves, what brought to me was, I thought was very interesting, was this long pattern of anger that you can see throughout history with respect to this kind of feeling of loss of a country. And quite honestly, what I would sort of translate that into is a sense of entitlement and privilege, that you are the only benefactor of this country, kind of thing, as exemplified in the insurrections that occurred. And of course, the legal machinations and the election pieces. You know what, like I said, I'm like a kid in a candy store with these conversations. It's so great to sort of be a part of these. And I really appreciate and thank you all for giving of your time and contributing to this, to what is a very complex, not 140 character conversation, right? So thank you all very much and have a good night.
Thank you.